The older I get, the more I find myself interested in games that take risks and do something really different. Games that experiment with art styles, mechanics, themes, and moods. Even if the game itself isn't terribly great, as long as it did something interesting, then I'm a lot more likely to remember it than something good that did nothing new. Earlier this year, I played through 2013's Anodyne. At the surface, it was an okay Link's Awakening clone, but the further you get into that thing, the more interesting it gets. Things get creepy and weird, and the game starts to boast really interesting themes and experimental mechanics. Not to mention, it has hands down the coolest post-game quest of anything I've ever played, giving you a tool to move the game's tiles so you can find collectibles out of bounds. The game itself was nothing to write home about at first, but it did things that I will never forget. Anodyne was the love child of Sean Hantani and Marina Kitaka, an indie duo called Analgesic Productions, and they love to experiment. Each game they've made has been quite different than the last, Anodyne being a Zelda-like, Even the Ocean a side-scroller, All Our Ages a PS1-styled exploration-based narrative, and New Private Window a browser memoir exploring resonating themes. Marina describes Anodyne 2 as the ultimate culmination of all the experience they acquired by experimenting with each of these titles, combining their newfound familiarity with writing, 3D artwork, game design, and storytelling. Anodyne 2 would be their biggest and greatest project. This was actually the game that made me discover them to begin with. Just seeing how this thing looked was enough to get me interested. It was so surreal and beautiful looking, and the low poly, low res art direction resonated with me really well. I always thought the PlayStation 1 was the best console for finding those weirder games. It was that perfect moment in history where games were getting really popular to develop, and they were cheaper than ever to produce with the CD technology. That and the fact that at this point in time, games were still simple enough to not really need a big budget to make. It was only during this time where you'd get games like Planet Daub. It's like Toe Jam and Earl on LSD, it's awesome. Or LSD itself, an interactive dream simulator. These are the kinds of interesting games that I love to find out about, and since they have that PS1 jagged edge look to it, that's the art style that most effectively reels me into something weird like this. And I do know that Sean is no stranger to old weird stuff like this. I remember one time a buddy and I were looking up gameplay of this old weird Japanese PS1 game called Moon Remix RPG or something like that, and one of the only results we could find was an old Let's Play by Sean himself. It doesn't really surprise me though, because I know this is a guy that loves old weird stuff so much that he released his soundtrack on cassette, and I have to admit that is pretty freaking cool. Anodyne 2 has probably been one of my most highly anticipated indie games like ever. I've been so eager to play this ever since the first time I saw what it looked like, and now that's exactly what I'm about to do. Now, the first thing this game makes crystal clear is that it's not a direct sequel to the original title. I guess in the same way that each Final Fantasy game isn't, the gameplay and themes are reminiscent of the original game, but the story and characters, they're entirely original and new. You can play each game in any order, but I do personally recommend playing Anodyne 1 before the sequel. It's not essential, you can't skip right to the second game, but there is a lot of great callbacks to the original game that you'll definitely appreciate a lot more if you played it. Like the game's world being called New Theland, an obvious nod to the original game's world being called The Land. But there's a lot of other great stuff that I'm not gonna spoil. Now that is a title screen. The colors and composition are just incredible, and the remix of the original game's music is as mesmerizing as ever. Also, big shout out to having the PlayStation button show up if you're playing with the DualShock. It is so annoying to me when games only have the Xbox buttons. I've never been an Xbox guy, so I don't really know the layout of an Xbox controller by heart, so if you tell me to hit the X button on an Xbox controller, it's gonna break my brain. We take on the role of Nova, a newborn, childlike being created by these two mysterious motherly figures who work for an organization called the Center, Sea Psalmist and Palisade. Nova was created to battle a microscopic entity that's corrupting the world's inhabitants. You have been born into a war zone. It's not a contest of swords or guns, of armies or infantry. We wage a war that is nearly invisible. Nova's a nano-cleaner, a being that can shrink to nanoscopic sizes so she can clean this corrupting dust from its hosts. We get to see the literal birth of this character, playing through the trials she must overcome to hatch from the strange orange egg she was conceived in, collecting the 3 elements of nurturing she needs to grow into her full form and reach the land of the living. With these collected, something called a glandalox seed takes form inside of her head, granting her everything she needs to stay alive and healthy. With this, she doesn't require basic human needs like sleeping and eating. It also lets her communicate with the center. Alright, so Anodyne's 2 gameplay is a mix of 3D segments full of exploration and a little bit of platforming, and 2D segments that more closely resemble the first game. The overworld is played in 3D with that amazing PS1 look to it. Well, I don't really know if you can actually call it PS1 because the resolution is low and the lines are jagged, yeah, but there's definitely some techniques much more modern here, like the way that lights reflects off of the textures. It's a bizarre mashup of both retro and modern visual styles, and it looks pretty incredible, especially the water. Oh man, the way the light just glazes over it. You can't really do that on the PS1. Some of these areas are just freaking beautiful. The open world is very Shadow of the Colossus, with sweeping landscapes, empty wastelands littered with well-placed structures that catch your eye and have you investigate, leading you to areas that you'll have to explore. Once you find something of importance, usually an NPC in need of your help, you'll then shrink down inside of them to clean out the corrupting dust. The shrinking process is really cool. It's a sequence of timed direction presses to shield you against these projectiles trying to knock you back, and I think it's really interesting how these portions always take place on what looks like a highway. I mean, what do you use to get to a faraway place, right? And what's further from home than a world so small, you can't even see it. I mean, it might be physically close, but something looking like that is definitely very far from what you're used to seeing. The 2D sections often play like a Zelda dungeon, kinda similar to the dungeons of the first game, but the mechanics here are a lot more interesting. Instead of using a broom as a sword, we've now upgraded to a vacuum. It actually took me the entire game to realize this was a callback to the shopkeeper in the first game who was selling a vacuum. I mean, it makes sense, it's a better way of dealing with dust than a broom, right? But aside from just sucking up dust, you'll also find yourself sucking up and blasting out enemies and blocks. Not only is it for dealing with bad guys though, but you'll also use it for interacting with mechanisms so you can solve puzzles. You'll pull levers, move objects, that sort of stuff. And the puzzles here are a lot more robust than they were before. Not only is a vacuum something that lends itself a little bit more naturally to something like puzzle solving, but the ideas here are just more interesting. Each dungeon seems to sport its own unique gimmicks. You'll always be finding yourself doing something new. Like this dungeon here that's all about pulling levers, or this one that has you trying not to kill certain enemies. This one has these boomerang guys for chucking around corners. It's definitely a huge step up from the very basic switch puzzles the first game was limited to. And the HUD's seen a really big upgrade too. Anodyne 1 had a super slim aspect ratio to kinda try and emulate the Game Boy since it was very much inspired by Link's Awakening, and Anodyne 2's nanoscopic section still boasts that same aspect ratio, but now the screen is carefully filled with something a lot more interesting to look at than just solid black. I think having the health on the side of the screen instead of the top was a really good decision, along with how much dust you've collected, what's currently stored in your vacuum. The glandalox seed is also on the right, and you can watch it react to certain scenes. And the rest is just visual fluff for the sake of filling the screen the rest of the way. I really like what they did with it. It's like we're using a device to see where we are because we're too small, and the background behind that blends into the background really nicely, those squiggly strands that border the edges. It fits the theme of being small and inside somebody. And these tiny areas aren't simply representative of the creature's innards. It's not like Jabu Jabu's belly or the giant Yuban Partners in Time. You're not just inside somebody's body. Some of these hosts have entire worlds with people living inside them. It's like an entirely different dimension within the molecules of your body. And some of the later 2D areas, instead of being a semi-linear dungeon, they become sprawling open worlds with a big quest to undertake. The map goes from a simple grid to a wide open landscape. Like the medieval world, you go on a big quest to search for the 4 pieces of a legendary armor set so you can slay a dragon. The game goes full Paper Mario sometimes. As you clear more and more of the 2D sections, more of the 3D world will open up. At first you're confined to just the large city of Sinnoh, helping the sick locals, but later you'll be exploring the world in its entirety, finding tons of weird and interesting characters, like these dolphin-looking guys that own a car wash. You gotta fix it for them by jumping your way up into the roof. There's some very light elements of platforming here. You're given the most basic and easy to use abilities, the double jump and a slow descent move, so there's no real challenge in getting there, but the appeal comes from the exploration itself. Performing the actions you need to climb up isn't very interesting, but looking around the property and then figuring out how to get there definitely is. Just looking around for anything of interest is incredibly fun to do, and sometimes you'll be rewarded with the occasional hidden card. Oh right, that's another thing that comes back here. In Anodyne 1 you could collect these trading cards to unlock doors, and then by the end of the game the entire purpose became collecting enough to open the final area. Anodyne 2 follows a similar structure. The plot is progressed by cleaning the dust from each NPC, but by the end of the game, it'll boil down to collecting enough cards to see the ending, kinda like getting enough stars to fight Bowser. This game is a lot more story-driven than the first game was. You would occasionally talk to an NPC and get some vague text that could maybe relate to the main character, but Anodyne 2 is a lot more directly driven by its narrative, complete with cutscenes, character development, and of course, a lot of symbolism and themes to interpret. Sometimes even the host you'll enter will have a good share of character development. As you explore their innards, you'll meet the tiny denizens of civilizations within them, and you might even uncover their memories too. Like Jeff here, a mayor of a city that's infested by a fungus that's making everybody sick, so he digs and digs looking for the source of it, but he digs so much that he ends up destroying all of their usable soil, so they can no longer make crops or do trade with other towns. Or Gustine, who's been turned gluttonous by the dust. He needs you to clean him so his palate will go back to normal and he can stop eating so much. But the character to get the most development is easily Nova herself. She was created for a purpose and takes comfort in understanding her place in the world and knowing that everything will always be perfect as long as she has that role to fill. But as she meets more and more outsiders, ones that don't have roles, ones that don't have a purpose, she starts to see the appeal in human imperfection, requiring things like sleeping and eating. I mean, the poor girl didn't even know she could talk until meeting these people, because before, she didn't have to. She had no reason to. It was never required of her. Nova is literally a newborn, not in the human sense of physically being a baby, but she was literally born yesterday. And there's moments where, despite Nova being created to fill a very specific role, Palisade can't help but to feel like she has to fulfill her motherly duties, protecting Nova from harm and cradling her like a child. It's almost like a Solid Snake scenario, you know, a genetically engineered super soldier made specifically for a purpose, a man-made machine of a human. But to somebody, this is still a mother's child, regardless of that child's purpose. And I think the soundtrack really complements this idea pretty well. Despite being in a vast and strange alien world, the music is always ambient and comforting, like a mother's arms embracing you in situations of strange. The themes here primarily circle around nurturing and purpose, and I think it's a really interesting take on existentialism, as pretentious and over-freaking used that word's kind of become, but, you know, like so many of us are desperately searching for a meaning, a purpose, you know, like, what is this? Where did it come from? Why is it here, and what am I supposed to do? It's kind of weird to think about, but I think there's legitimate harmony in the answers. Who knows? Who cares? For no reason and whatever you want. It sort of parallels Cypher's philosophy in The Matrix.
Ignorance is bliss.
Actually, you know what? I think it might be like the opposite of that, come to think of it. Like, instead of ignorance, you know, choosing not to understand the world so you can continue to live comfortably and have a place, maybe understanding the world and embracing its pointlessness could instead be what leads to a more satisfying life. In a sense, I guess having no purpose is true bliss. Maybe nothing needs to be a certain way. Playing it by ear is sometimes better than adhering to a set of rules, even if those rules are intended to keep us safe and happy. I don't know, maybe I'm just spewing bullshit at this point, but hey, I love philosophy. It's also ambiguous the way the story unfolds too. It's really difficult to make up your mind on who's in the right and who to trust throughout most of the story, and it had me thinking a lot about who is truly right. I mean, of course I'm being as freaking vague as I totally can so I don't spoil this game's story, so I don't know, take from that what you will, I guess. Just like the first Anodyne, this game also has a lot of weird humor in it, a lot of very meta humor, kinda deconstructing staples of game design. I love this graffiti here that literally just says, environmental storytelling, and this card description from somebody trapped in a flavor text factory complaining about how they're forced to write blurbs all day. There is a lot of super meta stuff in this game. In fact, it's so meta that it makes Undertale look tame by comparison. Halfway through the game, they introduce a new collectible called Metacoins, and you can use these to buy non-canon parts of the game. Think of it like art galleries and behind-the-scenes stuff you would see in other games, except here, it's fully playable debug and testing rooms, complete with developer commentary about their mindset and process when designing earlier versions of some of the game's areas. This is easily one of the coolest rewards I've ever seen for collecting stuff. Sean even had the nerve of hiding a lot of these coins out of bounds, so just like the first game, you'll find yourself looking for a lot of stupid ways of breaking the game's boundaries on the ultimate fourth wall breaking coin hunt. In fact, you can actually find me in the game. Like, I jokingly tweeted at Sean asking, hey, why don't you put me in the game? But he actually did. I'm in like this super hard to find, completely out of bounds area though that you have to use glitches to get to. So if you find me, tweet at me a screenshot. I want to see it. You're not going to get a super cool item like the swap tool from the first game to do this, so the whole process isn't quite as cool as it was in Anodyne 1, but it's still a hell of a lot of fun to do once you finish the game. Though I did find some of these coins to feel a little bit intrusive before I got to that post-game. It is a really good incentive to explore more of the world around you, but I found a lot of the normally within bounds placed ones to be just kind of boring to collect. Because previously, I was only attracted to areas of interest and I would explore based on that, but now I'm over here hugging this wall, not because this wall is interesting to go to, but because there's just coins over here. I think if they made these ones a little more sparse, it would have felt a little less cumbersome of an idea to those who aren't really interested in the post-game stuff. Well, at least there's nothing too crazy like waiting 2 hours for a rabbit to cross the screen. A big part of me actually really misses that stuff though, like the super ridiculous, I wonder if anyone will even find this sort of thing. But I do admit that kind of stuff does make the game a lot more inaccessible to most people, so I totally see why he omitted it this time. They also did a pretty good job on covering their asses for not having a reward for getting everything this time, because when Anodyne 1 came out, getting everything was really hard and you got nothing for it, and people were pissed. This time, there's straight up a line of text in the game that says, you get nothing for 100%, don't complain about it on forums this time because I warned you. I thought that was pretty great, but whether or not there actually is something for getting everything, whether or not you should actually trust that line of dialogue, I'll leave that up to you guys to find out yourselves. There's also some other really cool stuff that I really can't talk about without destroying the experience, so I guess this is where we hit spoilers. I do want to talk about the interesting things this game does and my interpretation of it, since I did that with the first game, but I must warn you, this segment of the video is only for people that have completed the game. Otherwise, skip here. I really do have to stress this as firmly as I possibly can. This is an incredible experience, this game, and knowing about these things going into it will greatly take away from that. I'm talking experience-shattering spoilers, so please, if you have not played this game, skip this part of the video. This part of the video is only for those that know what happens, have played through it themselves, and maybe just wanted to see what I thought about it. So, last chance. Okay, let's talk. So firstly, I guess we'll talk about that ending. Once you have all of the cards and enough dust, the center's representatives want to initiate an apocalyptic event called the Anodyne, ending all life as we know it, returning to dust and achieving perfect harmony. I guess it's like the third impact from Evangelion, you know, like all life returning to its basic raw ingredients so it can be reunited. It's here that Nova has to make a decision, go through with it and fulfill her purpose, or take her experiences with outsiders and challenge the center to create her own path instead. But that's easier said than done, because that glandalock seed inside her brain not only provides her with life, but also makes it very difficult to experience anything deemed unnecessary. Bonds with others, human emotion, anything that could get in the way of her mission is suppressed by this seed. After betraying the center, they end up creating a new nanocleaner named Zera. Nova shrinks down inside of her on one final suicide mission to remove the glandalock seed from Zera's brain so she can be free of the center and she can create her own path. If Nova can't do it herself, she'll at least let the next nanocleaner be the one who can. So in one final super super cool boss fight, we destroy Zera's Glandalox seed, but in absolute horror, we realize that in removing it, we didn't only free her of the center's grasp, but we also removed what's supporting her life functions, and Zera shrinks into a red pulp, a tiny mass of unmoving flesh and cloth. But Nova doesn't give up there. She still wins the fight against her superiors and avoids initiating the Anodyne, and right there and then, she notices that pile of clothes is now moving. She realized that in removing the Glandalox seed, she didn't actually murder Zera, but instead reverted her to what a newborn should actually be, a little baby girl that requires basic human needs. And this is why I think the game's ending is so powerful, not just because Nova breaks free of her purpose and becomes her own being that gets to experience the wonders of a meaningless life with all the freedom in the world, but she surpasses her pseudo-childlike nature and becomes a mother herself, this time using the experience she learned from outsiders to raise the child, instead of the rules the center programmed into her. But even still, with this awesome happily ever after, there's one thing about this entire game that just bugged me and bugged me and bugged me. Alright, so remember how in the first game I kind of thought that the land was a sort of fantasy envisioned by Young in order to escape his reality, and then at the end he leaves the land after overcoming his anxieties? Well, it turns out New Theland isn't just a reference to the land. It is, in fact, a literal physical successor to the land. After Young left, the whole place started to crumble, as if the visionary not being there to envision the world meant it would no longer exist. This part is so freaking cool. You actually get to explore the crumbling remains of the land, those maps you explored in the first game, and you'll see a mess of tiles all jumbled around from when the sage desperately was trying to use the swap tool to escape, and most people, of course, ended up escaping to New Theland. So what bothers me so much about this is that, does this mean this world is still an imagining simply to serve as an escape from social interaction like it might have been in the first game? So get this. This is where things start melting my freaking brain. There's a part where you go to the Nexus from the first game, and here you can learn to shrink down even further, exploring the innards of already nanoscopic beings, going picoscopic, and their gameplay looks even more primitive than going from 3D to 2D. You go from 2D to Atari. Okay, so with that in mind, there's one NPC you can find called Desert NPC. There's something different about it. It doesn't act like any other character. Instead, it's a glitchy, incomplete script full of placeholders. And when you initiate the nanoscale, you're sucked in despite the blast relentlessly smashing into you. No such scene. You go into a 2D world that resembles like a testing room, and then... What is this? Is this the real world? Like, were we playing a game the whole time? We spend a good 15 minutes with this character here named not Nova, but Nora, in a completely different art style. She experiences the monotony of a daytime job, the anxieties of talking to people, and it's all capped off with a terrifying segment of being chased down this labyrinth-like hallway by a gargoyle. And the only way you can escape this thing is by jumping back into the computer and resuming the world of Anodyne 2, going back to New Theland. This part of the game really messed with me, dude, because, like, it's really unclear because this is a game where you're in the 3D world and you shrink into a 2D world, so it's really unclear whether you simply shrunk forward into a world or backed out into the real one. If this is indeed the real world, that means the entirety of Nova's adventure was nothing more than a fantasy, in the same way that Anodyne 1's was for Young. It means that while Nova did overcome her purpose and carve her own way, Nora, our real protagonist, actually failed to overcome her real-world anxieties and chose to remain within New Theland, unlike Young, who overcame them and left back to the real world. If this is indeed what is going on, it turns this happy ending into something kind of depressing in a way, and it mirrors the ending of the first game really interestingly. It turns out that Young was really the one to escape his purpose, and Nora, while deceiving herself into thinking she chose understanding and purposelessness, she actually chose ignorance and purpose by staying within the game. She hangs on to the fallacy that ignorance is bliss. And of course, I have to make it perfectly clear that this is simply just my interpretation of it. I'm not going to be one of those channels that's like, this game explained, I'm going to tell you what to think, I'm going to tell you how to interpret this thing. No, what you take from it could be totally different, but that's just my 2 cents. Either way, it is a mind-bending experience. By the end of this game, I was like a mixed bag of confusion and excitement, and I tell ya, I love something that can do that to me. But regardless of how you piece this game's plot together, you know, interpreting it as the simple story it poses as, or something far greater when you look at wider factors, I think I can at least say this is top to bottom a fan-freaking-tastic game. As much as I do love it, I have to admit that Anodyne 1 was a pretty average game. It just did some interesting things halfway and got really cool by the end, but Anodyne 2 right out of the gate is a straight-up great game, and it continues to explore ground that's just as, if not even more interesting. The gameplay is just a lot better, the puzzles, the exploration, the control, everything here has the defined improvements that a sequel should come with, while at the same time exploring new territory altogether. The fourth wall breaking post-game stuff is still there with the metacoins, but it's not quite as cool as the swap tool stuff from the first game, but I do think that is a sacrifice that had to happen to make an overall better and more accessible game. Whether you're playing the game for the puzzle solving, or the bizarre characters, or the exploration of amazing and weird worlds, or the breathtaking art direction, or maybe the mind-bending meta-narrative, there's something I think everybody can enjoy here. Newcomers will take very well to the more accessible experience, and older fans will love the ambitious narrative the game undertakes. Anodyne 2 is an amazing freaking game, and it's pretty chunky too for something made by just 2 people. It'll take you maybe 6 to 8 hours to complete, quite a bit more if you want to do the post-game stuff with the metacoins and stuff, but yeah, it's available on Steam and itch.io, but of course, I recommend getting it on itch.io over Steam, because that way you A, get it DRM free, and B, more money goes to the people who actually made it that way, because Steam isn't there to take a cut. And I know people are always like, I want everything in the same place, but in my eyes, it is in the same place. It's on my computer. Some of it's on Steam, but some of it's in a folder on my desktop, and that's fine by me. These people put in a lot of effort to make us these amazing games, and it only requires a little bit of effort to show your support. But regardless of where you buy it, just please play this game, and talk about it too. Like, Anodyne 1 sparked this awesome community of people trying to crack those post-game puzzles, but I imagine this time it's going to be a community of people trying to find those metacoins and to crack into the game's story. So, by all means, let me know what you thought of the game and maybe what you interpreted from it, because I love games that spark conversation. And let me tell you, Anodyne 2 will most certainly be one of those games.